The chains of a forgotten world. In a distant corner of the galaxy, under the shadow of a dying star, there existed a planet known to its inhabitants as Oryx, a world surrounded by a thick veil of mystery, where the air was heavy with the scent of decay and the sky was perpetually overcast, as if the heavens themselves had abandoned the planet. It was a place that could never be described as alive, not in the way that humanity understood life. The inhabitants, though of alien origin, had been trapped in a cycle so old that they no longer even knew they were prisoners. The idea of freedom was nothing more than a forgotten myth, whispered only by those whose minds still reached for the stars, even though their hands had long since been bound. Among these beings, there was one who was different. She was human, isolated, a foreigner in a land where her kind had been forgotten by time. Her name was Ilara. And unlike the creatures around her, she remembered what it was like to dream. She could still feel the stirrings of a forgotten history, fragments of memories that didn't belong to the world she now inhabited. For Ilara, the chains that bound the people of Oryx were not physical, they were mental, spiritual. The inhabitants of this world had been conditioned from birth to obey without question, to toil without hope, to live without joy. Yet Ilara was not like them. Her mind was still free, even if her body was shackled. She had come to Oryx long ago, when the galaxy was still a vibrant place of discovery. She had been part of a great expedition, a crew sent to study alien life and explore new frontiers. But when the mission went awry, when disaster struck, Ilara had found herself stranded on this desolate world, the last surviving member of her crew. The others were lost to the void, their fates unknown. She was alone. Ilara's existence on Oryx had been a quiet rebellion against the life that had been forced upon her. She worked the fields, just as the others did, harvesting crops and maintaining the city's technology. But in the silence of her work, she pondered the forgotten stories that echoed in her mind. She remembered the earth she had once called home, the cities of towering spires, the oceans that shimmered under a bright sun. She remembered freedom, the ability to choose, to speak without fear, to fight for a future. It was these memories that had kept her spirit alive, even when all around her seemed to wither. But the people of Oryx knew nothing of freedom. They lived in a haze, their lives measured by the endless cycle of work, sleep, and submission. The leaders of Oryx, a race of towering, emotionless beings called the Tyr-Kai, had long ago subdued the minds of the population. Their control was absolute, not through force, but through subtlety. Every thought, every desire, every action was dictated by a system so deeply ingrained that the inhabitants of Oryx had no idea that their lives were anything but normal. Ilara had learned their ways, their language, their customs. She had become a part of this world, yet she never forgot who she was. She had studied their technology, their culture, and had even made attempts to understand their minds. But the Tyr-Kai were masters of manipulation, and their power over the people was unyielding. They had made Oryx their prison, and Ilara was their only prisoner who dared to dream of escape. For years, Ilara had lived quietly, blending into the rhythm of Oryx's society. She had done what was required of her, never drawing attention to herself, never showing the depths of her inner conflict. But in the silence of her nights, when the others slept, she would look to the stars, wondering if anyone would ever come for her, wondering if she would ever escape. One day, while working in the city's central garden, Ilara overheard something that would change everything. A group of Tyr-Kai officials was discussing a new project, one that seemed to involve a strange, unknown technology. It was nothing like anything she had seen before, and for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. What if this technology could be the key to her escape? What if it could break the chains that bound her? The thought consumed her. She knew she had to learn more, to discover the truth behind this mysterious project. But doing so would require more than just intelligence and skill. It would require daring. It would require defiance. And most of all, it would require her to take a step that no one on Oryx had ever dared to take before, the step toward freedom. As Ilara stood there in the garden, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, she made a decision. She would no longer be a passive observer. She would no longer be a prisoner. The time had come for her to act. The time had come for humanity to reclaim its destiny. The spark of rebellion. The following days on Oryx passed in a haze of routine. Ilara's mind, however, was far from idle. Every action, every word, every movement of the Tyre-Kai officials and the inhabitants of the planet seemed to carry new meaning to her now. She watched the people with new eyes, noticing the way their movements had become automated, their expressions blank, their conversations hollow. It was as if they were living out their days in a dream they had long since forgotten to question. Ilara had never been one to conform. Her experiences back on Earth, though distant now, had shaped her sense of individuality and independence. On Earth, people had fought for their rights, struggled for freedom, and had dreamed of a future where they could shape their own destinies. Here on Oryx, it was as if those ideals had never existed. But now, with the discovery of the Tyre-Kai's secret project, Ilara found herself standing at a crossroads. She could no longer pretend that she was just another worker in the endless machine of Oryx. The spark of rebellion, which had smoldered deep within her for so long, had finally been lit. That night, after her duties were done, and the dim lights of Oryx's city flickered weakly in the distance, Ilara sat in the small, bare room she called home. The walls were made of a cold, metallic substance, and the floor was hard and unyielding. There was little comfort to be found here, just a constant reminder of the alien world she had been trapped on for so long. Yet it was in this room, under the harsh glow of a single overhead light, that Ilara would begin to plan the course of her destiny. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a worn-out datapad in her hands. It was an old device, one that had once belonged to her crew before they were lost. It had no real value to the inhabitants of Oryx, as it contained nothing of use to them. To Ilara, however, it was a connection to a past life, a lifeline to the knowledge she had once possessed. She powered the device on, and a holographic screen flickered to life in front of her. For the first time in years, she accessed the archives of the expedition she had been part of, searching for anything that could help her understand the technology the Tyre-Kai were working on. The archives were vast, containing everything from scientific data to cultural studies, but it was a file marked Project X that caught her attention. She had never heard of it before, but there was something about it that drew her in. Ilara opened the file, and the information that followed nearly made her heart stop. Project X was not just a technological breakthrough. It was a weapon that could alter the very fabric of reality itself. It was a device designed to control minds, to manipulate thoughts and actions on a massive scale. It was the perfect tool for the Tyre-Kai to maintain their absolute control over the inhabitants of Oryx. With it, they could ensure that no one would ever question their authority, no one would ever dare to resist. It was the ultimate form of oppression, and it was closer to completion than Ilara could have imagined. Her mind raced as she read through the data. The weapon was not just a physical machine. It was connected to the very essence of Oryx itself. It drew power from the planet's unique energy source, and once activated, it would be capable of controlling the minds of every living being on the planet. The more Ilara read, the more she realized the implications of this discovery. If the Tyre-Kai succeeded in completing Project X, it would be the end of any hope for resistance. It would mean total subjugation, not just for her, but for everyone on Oryx. No one would ever know freedom again. But Ilara had something the Tyre-Kai could never account for: her humanity. She had been raised on the principles of freedom, of self-determination. She understood the power of the human mind, its capacity to overcome even the greatest of odds. The Tyre-Kai may have had their technology, but they could never understand the resilience of the human spirit. That was the key to her survival. That was her strength. She spent the next few days gathering information, carefully planning her next move. The Tyre-Kai were a formidable enemy, but Ilara knew that they were not invincible. She had studied their ways, their behavior, their technology. She knew their strengths and weaknesses, and she was determined to exploit them. It would be dangerous, but it was the only way forward. She began to secretly communicate with the inhabitants of Oryx, reaching out to those few who still retained fragments of memory, those who had not yet been fully indoctrinated by the Tyr-Kai. There were whispers in the streets, in the markets, in the quiet corners of the city where the workers gathered. People had begun to notice that something was different about Ilara. Her eyes were filled with a fire that they had not seen in years. She no longer obeyed the commands of the Tyr-Kai without question. She had become a symbol of hope, though she did not yet know how far that hope could spread. One night, as she walked through the city under the cover of darkness, Ilara found herself face to face with a group of workers who had been secretly gathering in the shadows. They had heard the whispers. They had seen the signs, and now they had come to her, seeking the same thing she sought: freedom. "We have heard your name," one of them said, her voice barely a whisper. "You are the one who remembers. You are the one who dares to dream. Will you help us? Will you lead us to freedom?" Ilara looked at them, her heart pounding in her chest. These were not the cowed, broken people she had once known. These were people who were beginning to believe again. They were the first sparks of a rebellion, the first seeds of a movement that could change everything. But she knew that leading them would not be easy. The Tyr-Kai would not let them go without a fight. "I will lead you," Ilara said, her voice steady, filled with conviction. "But we must act quickly. The Tyr-Kai are closer than we realize. We will need a plan, and we will need to move in secrecy. This is just the beginning, but it will take all of us, together, to make it work." And so, the journey began. Ilara and the small group of rebels moved in the shadows, gathering allies, planning their attack on the Tyr-Kai's facility, where Project X was being constructed. The rebellion had only just begun, but already there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. A plan in the shadows. The days that followed were filled with secretive meetings and whispered conversations in the dark corners of Oryx's city. Ilara knew the stakes had never been higher. The rebellion she had unknowingly sparked was growing. And with it, the danger. The Tyr-Kai, as powerful and controlling as they were, had begun to notice the subtle changes in their society. The whispers among the workers had become more frequent, the glances more knowing. It was only a matter of time before the Tyr-Kai would take notice of Ilara's defiance, and they would crush it with the same efficiency they used to crush everything else on this lifeless world. But for now, Ilara was undetected. She and her small band of rebels moved in silence, gathering in hidden alcoves and underground tunnels that were known only to a few. They had to act quickly, for the time was running out. The Tyr-Kai had almost completed Project X, and once it was activated, it would be too late to stop them. The weapon would control every mind on Oryx, ensuring their complete and total dominance. It would turn every living creature into a mere puppet of their will. Ilara could not allow that to happen. As the days passed, the small group of rebels grew. The workers, the farmers, the engineers, all of them had come to Ilara, each with their own story of rebellion, of the fire that still burned within them despite the years of oppression. Each person had something to offer. Some brought knowledge of the city's infrastructure. Others had insights into the Tyr-Kai's communication network. A few were even skilled in the art of sabotage. It was a ragtag group, but it was exactly what Ilara needed. People who were willing to risk everything for the chance at freedom. One of the rebels was a former Tyr-Kai engineer named Jarek. He had once worked for the very government that Ilara was now fighting. His eyes, unlike the cold, emotionless gaze of the Tyr-Kai, still held the warmth of humanity, something that had been stripped from most of the inhabitants of Oryx. He had come to Ilara after realizing that he could no longer serve the Tyr-Kai. The atrocities they had committed, the control they exerted over the people, had broken something in him. He had defected, seeking redemption in the only way he knew how, by helping Ilara in her fight. "Ilara," Jarek said one evening, his voice low as he leaned over a table filled with maps of the city's infrastructure. The facility where Project X is being built is heavily guarded. It's surrounded by an electromagnetic field that prevents any kind of external communication. Getting in will be nearly impossible, but I have an idea. We could use the city's central power grid to create a diversion, enough of a disruption to lower their defenses, even if just for a short time. If we can get inside, we can destroy the weapon before it's activated. Ilara nodded, her eyes narrowing in thought. But the power grid is closely monitored. One wrong move, and the entire city will be on high alert. I know, Jarek replied, his fingers tapping on the map. But there's a weakness in their security protocols. The Tyre-Kai underestimate the city's reliance on manual overrides. I used to maintain that system. If we can access the central control room, I can create a blackout that will cripple their operations for a few hours. Ilara's mind raced as she considered the plan. A blackout would give them a small window of opportunity to strike, but it would also put them at risk of being discovered. The Tyre-Kai would not stand idle while someone sabotaged their most important project. They had to move fast, and they had to be smart. One mistake could mean the end of their rebellion before it even had a chance to succeed. We can do it, Ilara said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. But we need more than just a plan. We need allies, people who are willing to fight back. This won't be easy. The group gathered again that night, their faces grim but determined. Ilara outlined the plan, explaining the need to infiltrate the central control room, disable the power grid, and then storm the facility where Project X was being constructed. It was a dangerous mission, one that required precision and coordination. But the rebels were willing to risk everything. They had come to see Ilara as their leader, and they trusted her with their lives. As the hours passed, the team worked tirelessly, preparing for the mission ahead. Jarek and a few others worked on hacking into the city's communication network, ensuring that the Tyre-Kai would be unaware of their movements. The rest of the group gathered weapons and tools, preparing for the fight that would soon come. Ilara spent her time checking and rechecking every detail, making sure that no stone was left unturned. The night before the mission, Ilara stood on the rooftop of a crumbling building, gazing out over the city. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the empty streets. For the first time in years, Ilara felt a sense of purpose. She had spent so long wondering if anyone would ever come to help her, if she would ever find a way off this wretched planet. But now she had her answer. The people of Oryx had come together, united by a common cause. They had become more than just rebels. They had become a family, bound together by their shared desire for freedom. As she stared out at the desolate skyline, Ilara's thoughts drifted to earth. She remembered the oceans, the vast skies, the bustling cities. She remembered what it was like to be free. And though she had long since accepted that she might never return home, she now understood something that she hadn't before. Freedom was not just a place. It was a state of mind, a belief that no matter the circumstances, no matter how many chains bound you, the human spirit could never truly be defeated. And in that moment, Ilara knew that she would fight for that freedom, not just for herself, but for all the people of Oryx. The next morning, as the first rays of the distant sun broke through the clouds, the rebellion began. The heart of the beast. The air was thick with tension as Ilara and her group prepared for the most dangerous mission of their lives. The plan they had meticulously crafted over the past few weeks was simple, but it was fraught with peril. Time was their enemy, and the longer they waited, the closer the Tyre-Kai would come to completing Project X. Every hour that passed brought them one step closer to their goal, but it also brought them closer to the moment when the Tyre-Kai would notice the cracks in their system, and the rebellion would be crushed. The morning of the mission arrived, and the city of Oryx, as it had been every day for as long as Ilara could remember, was still in a state of quiet oppression. The streets were lined with workers going about their monotonous tasks, their faces blank, their eyes dull. It was a city alive in form, but dead in spirit. Yet, for Ilara and her rebels, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. They were no longer just individuals. They were a collective force, driven by the singular goal of freeing their world from the Tyrkay's grip. In the dim hours before dawn, the rebels gathered in the hidden alcove beneath the city. Ilara stood at the front, her eyes scanning the faces of the people she had come to trust. Jarek, who had worked tirelessly on the city's power grid, was beside her, his face set with grim determination. The rest of the group, those skilled in sabotage, those who knew the inner workings of the Tyrkai stronghold, stood at attention, waiting for the signal to move. Ilara felt her heart pounding in her chest as she took a deep breath. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. It would not be an easy fight. The Tyrkai were more powerful, more organized, but they had one critical weakness. They underestimated the human spirit. They had relied on their superior technology and mind control for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to face a force that could not be broken with a single strike. Ilara knew what humanity was capable of. She had seen it on Earth, and now she would show it to the Tyrkai. Everyone ready? Ilara asked, her voice steady despite the rising adrenaline in her veins. Jarek nodded, checking the small device in his hand. The blackout will begin in 5 minutes. You'll have a small window before their systems reset. You have to move fast. Ilara looked at him and smiled faintly. Then we move fast. With a final nod of agreement, the rebels slipped into the shadows, heading toward their various objectives. They moved quickly, blending into the crowd of workers as they made their way to the central control room. Ilara had never seen the inner workings of the Tyrkai's fortress, but thanks to Jarek's detailed maps and knowledge, she knew where to go. It was a labyrinth of steel corridors, surveillance systems, and automated defenses, but it was also the heart of the machine that controlled Oryx, and that was where they needed to strike. As they neared the central control room, Ilara's thoughts were a whirlwind of strategy and uncertainty. She had come a long way from the isolated woman who had first arrived on this planet. The rebel leader standing before the imposing gates of the Tyrkai's stronghold was a far cry from the frightened survivor who had stumbled upon this world so many years ago. She had learned to think like them, to move like them, and now she would use that knowledge to dismantle their empire, piece by piece. The first phase of their plan was simple: disable the security systems long enough to access the central control room. The Tyrkai were formidable, but they had grown complacent. They relied too heavily on their technology, never suspecting that anyone would dare challenge them. The rebels had already made sure to plant key devices throughout the city that would send the security systems into disarray. The blackout would create the chaos they needed to break through the gates undetected. Ilara's heart raced as she stood outside the control room, watching Jarek work his magic. The power grid would be down in less than 2 minutes. Once that happened, the entire city would be plunged into darkness, and the Tyrkai would scramble to restore order. But the rebels would already be inside, striking at the heart of the project before it could be completed. The countdown was underway. Suddenly, the lights above them flickered, and then went out entirely. The city was plunged into darkness. Ilara's pulse quickened as she motioned for her team to move. They surged forward, rushing through the now unprotected hallways. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the weight of the silence that hung in the air. Ilara could feel her breath catch in her throat as they rounded the corner to the central control room. This was it, the moment that they had been waiting for. The doors to the control room were reinforced, but not enough to withstand the force of their makeshift battering ram. With a loud crash, the doors were splintered open, and the rebels poured inside. The control room was a sprawling chamber, filled with rows of consoles and screens that displayed vital information about Oryx's systems. In the center of the room, a massive energy core hummed with life, its glow casting an eerie light over the scene. Ilara's eyes locked onto the core, knowing that this was the key to everything. If they could destroy it, they could take down the entire project. They would cripple the Tyrkai's control over the planet. Jarek immediately went to work, his hands flying over the console as he accessed the system's override. The sound of alarms blared in the distance. Security had already detected the breach. The countdown had begun. Ilara knew they had only minutes before the Tyrkai brought their full force to bear on them. "How much longer?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. "Almost there," Jarek said, his face illuminated by the flickering lights of the control panel. "I need another minute to breach the core's defenses." The rebels were tense, weapons drawn, watching every shadow for signs of movement. They had fought hard to get this far, and they would not let it slip away now. Ilara's eyes darted around the room, keeping a lookout for any sign of the Tyrkai's approach. She could hear their footsteps echoing down the halls, growing closer with every passing second. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the intercom, harsh and commanding. "Intruders in the control room. All units, converge on Sector 6. Do not allow them to escape." The Tyrkai were coming. Ilara's heart raced. They had to act now. With a final flourish, Jarek slammed his fist down on the console. The core's energy fluctuated, and the entire room seemed to tremble as the system was overloaded. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the core emitted a high-pitched whine as its power began to wane. "It's done," Jarek said, his voice hoarse from the effort. "The core is destabilized. We have less than 5 minutes before it detonates." Ilara looked at the others, her eyes filled with determination. "Everyone, move. We're not done yet. Let's get out of here." The rebels turned and fled, their mission complete, but their fight was far from over. As they raced through the hallways, Ilara couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They had struck a blow against the Tyrkai. They had taken the first step toward freedom. But as they neared the exit, a new threat emerged from the shadows. A squad of Tyrkai soldiers, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They had arrived just in time to witness the beginning of the end. Ilara's heart pounded as she turned to face them. The battle was far from over, but she had no intention of letting the Tyrkai win. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. The battle for survival. The seconds after the core had been destabilized felt like an eternity. The rebel group, now a tightly knit unit bound by purpose and determination, dashed through the darkened corridors of the Tyrkai stronghold, their hearts pounding as the sound of Tyrkai soldiers grew louder in the distance. The mission had been a success, but their escape was far from guaranteed. Ilara's mind raced as she calculated their options, every twist and turn of the labyrinthine facility adding pressure to their already limited time. The halls were silent, save for the pounding of their footsteps and the distant hum of the failing energy core. The blackout had disrupted the entire facility, but it wouldn't be long before the Tyrkai restored order. They had only a few minutes before the full might of the Tyrkai's forces arrived to reclaim what the rebels had stolen. "Keep moving," Ilara hissed under her breath as she led the group down a narrow corridor that veered off from the main halls. The soldiers had likely anticipated a breach in security and would be hunting for them, but if they could stay ahead of the Tyrkai's reinforcements, they might just make it out alive. Behind her, Jarek was still panting heavily, his face bathed in the cold glow of his makeshift device that he had used to destabilize the core. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept pace with the others. The mission had taken everything out of him, but the adrenaline rushing through his veins kept him from faltering. They were close to the exit. There was hope now, a fleeting but very real chance that they could break free. Ilara glanced over her shoulder to check on the others. She couldn't afford to lose anyone now. Kale, a former soldier who had joined the rebellion months earlier, was leading the rear, his pulse rifle held firmly in his hands. His face was set in a grim expression, his eyes sharp as he scanned the shadows behind them for any sign of pursuit. Tessa, a young engineer with a quick mind and faster hands, was beside Jarek, her eyes wide with fear, but she too was keeping up the pace. They had all made it this far, and Ilara wasn't going to let anything tear them apart now. "Which way?" Kale asked, his voice low and steady despite the chaos around them. Ilara stopped for a moment, her mind calculating. There was one exit, but it was a trap-laden route, guarded by the Tyrkai's most elite soldiers. The other exit was less guarded, but it required them to cross through the heart of the Tyrkai command center. The decision was difficult, but it was clear. The direct path would be their best chance of survival. To the left, Ilara ordered, pointing toward a small maintenance door that led into the bowels of the facility. We'll have to go through the lower levels to bypass their reinforcements. Stay quiet. Stay together. With a nod of agreement, the group moved swiftly, ducking through the narrow opening and into the maintenance corridor. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with old conduits and pipes. The space was cramped, but it offered some cover. There was a chance they could make it out without being detected. It was risky, but in a place like this, where every inch of the surface was monitored, it was the only option they had. As they moved deeper into the facility, the gravity of their situation settled in. They had successfully destabilized the core, but the Tyrkai would not give up without a fight. The rebellion had only begun, and already their most dangerous enemies were closing in. How much longer, Jarek? Ilara asked, her voice a little sharper now as they approached another sealed door. Not long, Jarek said, pulling out a small device and attaching it to the security panel. I can override the door's lock, but I'll need a few more seconds. Ilara glanced behind her as the group slowed to a halt. The silence around them was broken only by the distant sounds of metal clanging and the distant voices of Tyrkai soldiers. They were getting closer. The doors they were trying to bypass would lead them out into the lower levels, the last stretch before they could escape the stronghold. But as Jarek worked on the lock, a harsh voice echoed down the corridor. Too close for comfort. Ilara tensed. Stop them. The voice was unmistakable, one of the Tyrkai commanders. Do not let them leave the facility. Activate the lockdown. Ilara's heart sank as she heard the sound of mechanical locks sliding into place behind them. They were trapped. Go. Ilara shouted, turning to Kale. Get to the next door now. Before the words even left her lips, a series of mechanical shutters slammed down, sealing off their path. Panic surged through the rebels, but Ilara held it back. She couldn't afford to lose control now. The group turned and rushed in the opposite direction, but the heavy footfalls of the Tyrkai soldiers were growing louder too close. They would be upon them in mere moments. Ilara cursed under her breath. The timing had been off. They had underestimated the Tyrkai's ability to react. Move! Ilara barked again as Jarek began to work furiously on the next panel, his hands shaking as the pressure mounted. Ilara could hear the Tyrkai's voices now, hollow and cold, echoing in the hallway. Terminate the intruders. They must not escape. A sharp burst of energy suddenly crackled through the corridor. Ilara's eyes widened, and she raised her weapon just as a group of Tyrkai soldiers emerged from the shadows. There was no time to think. Get down, Kale shouted, pushing Ilara to the floor just as the first blast from the Tyrkai's rifles rang out. A firefight erupted in an instant. The rebels had the advantage of surprise, but the Tyrkai soldiers were relentless and brutal. They wore their armor with deadly efficiency, their movements quick and coordinated. Every shot they took was designed to kill. Ilara scrambled to her feet, her weapon aimed at the advancing soldiers. She squeezed the trigger, and the high-powered plasma shot ripped through the air, striking one of the soldiers in the chest. But there were more, so many more. Fall back, Ilara yelled. To the maintenance hatch. The rebels fired back, covering their retreat as the Tyrkai closed in. Ilara's mind raced. They had one option left. They had to reach the maintenance hatch before they were overrun. If they didn't, the rebellion would be crushed before it had even begun. Kale covered their retreat, holding back the oncoming Tyrkai soldiers with precise, calculated shots. Jarek, still shaken but determined, sprinted toward the hatch, pulling the heavy door open with all his strength. Tessa, her face pale but resolute, followed behind. "Come on," Ilara urged, her voice sharp as she fired another round, taking down one of the advancing soldiers. Just as they reached the hatch, a heavy blast tore through the corridor, sending a shockwave through the walls. The rebels stumbled but kept moving. They were running out of time, running out of options. But Ilara knew one thing. They couldn't stop now. The future of Oryx depended on them. And no matter what, they would not let the Tyrkai win. As the hatch slammed shut behind them, the sounds of the Tyrkai's fury echoed into the dark, but the rebels had made it to safety, at least for now. Their battle for freedom had only just begun, and they had survived one of the toughest tests yet. But the war was far from over.